I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave mental exaltation. That's why I've chosen my own particular profession, or rather created it, for I am the only one in the world. I'm Eddie Webb,
And I'm Chris Spivey.
and today we do a preface to a run of Sherlock Holmes covering some of the original short stories here on Genreless. Welcome to Genre's Book Club, where now we read books now. That's all we do.
So I don't know if anyone else realized this, since you probably can't because you can't see Eddie and you're not in the moment with us. But Eddie has like a violin on one side that I was sure he was going to play and play badly, just didn't make it sound perfect for the last couple minutes of the episode. But he put it aside right before we got started.
No, I'm going to pull an elementary and stick it in the bin and set it on fire. Woohoo! Deep cut Sherlock Holmes jokes. That's what we're here for. Yeah, we are doing our new
now
season.
We've lost our 5 listeners.
Yeah, well, I don't care. It amuses me, and it's going to amuse me for several episodes, so just buckle in. But yeah, no, we are doing a run of Sherlock Holmes, and we're doing this one a little bit differently. Obviously, as you heard, we're going to talk today about some of the original canonical stories because it's good to kind of have a foundation for Sherlock Holmes. But then we're going to go decade by decade through some iconic Sherlock Holmes media. So I think we're planning to cover 80 years, if I remember our notes correctly.
That was the original idea, but
right, we'll see how it goes. See how it plans out.
We'll see what happens.
Right. So before I
Eddie
get into this, yes.
Who's Sherlock Holmes?
Okay, no, I'm actually not answering the question because Sherlock Holmes is the most recognizable fictional character. There are 3 fictional characters that everyone in the world knows, and 2 of them are Sherlock Holmes and Superman. So,
who's the third one?
Depending on how you feel about religion, some people say Tarzan, some people say Jesus. So, take that how you.
So I've been to the Church of Tarzan. It is surprisingly breezy in that treehouse.
The animal acting is fantastic. No, Sherlock Holmes is probably the most well-known fictional character in the world. If you do not know who Sherlock Holmes is, I would love to talk to you actually, because I would like to know what set of circumstances allows you to not know who Sherlock Holmes is. Like I for those of you who don't know, I actually do have an entire sleeve of Sherlock Holmes tattoos, and I have not had one person point to my sleeve and go, "Who's that?" They point to my sleeve and go, "You have Sherlock Holmes." So I mean, random people on the street know who Sherlock Holmes is.
Well, Eddie, you're a being of means and well scholared, so you only hang out in those circles. You're not walking amongst plebes like myself who are unread. You are.
That is just not true.
God, I think this is just for us is really what we boiled down to. Before it was kind of just for us, but now we're solidly in. This is for no fucking body else but us.
But actually, before I get into this, I'm curious what your exposure to Sherlock Holmes was, assuming you know who Sherlock Holmes is.
I heard he's like a doctor that fought in the Afghan War, if I'm not mistaken, right?
You're so close and yet so wrong. Like most of these episodes.
I first encountered Sherlock Holmes with Jesus. That was so long ago.
With Jesus? Wow, that's impressive.
Well, I had to go back and make that connection from earlier just for people in case they were curious.
Tie it all together. Right.
See, look at that. See, Eddie, I am a podcast professional, and I'm trying to elevate your game to match mine. How is that for this morning's action? So one of the first memories I have of Sherlock Holmes is watching Murder by Decree with my grandmother.
Mm, I
And I want to
see.
say that was like, I think it came out in 78. So it was probably around 80 when we watched it. So it was
Yeah,
maybe
it was
5.
the 70s. That does explain some of your preferences we've discussed previously to this.
That sounds weird and so
Well,
many
yeah,
jokes I could go now. I'm
right.
thrown off by my options.
I will just say, so it sounds less weird, is that we talked about a lot of different options, and Chris mentioned Murder by Decree as one of the options, and I think we're gonna go. We'll see. We'll see what happens when we get there. I'm not gonna promise anything. I may
My
change my
my
mind.
other big memory of Sherlock Holmes, and the reason I got back into it in my teens, because I read the books shortly after that, and
Mm,
I saw some of the Basil Rathbones and stuff. Then I fell away from it for a good decade or so. But late high school, like my junior or senior year, I was hanging out with some friends, and one of their friends' dad had remarried, and the stepmom was really into Sherlock Holmes and all the Jeremy Bretts, and she
mm.
was super hot. And so, as a young developing person, I knew some Sherlock, and I would talk to her about Sherlock, and then I would just hang out with her and watch Sherlock Holmes, and think, man, she's hot. That was it. Like that. If you want to know, like 16-year-old Chris's brain, there you go.
I mean, to be fair, that's I think most 16-year-olds in general. So I'm not entirely surprised. But yeah, I mean, like that's my journey was a little similar in the sense that when I was
You knew
growing
my
up,
friend's stepmom?
I did actually. Yeah, she was hot. I can confirm. No, I grew up. Grandfather, my grandfather and my mother both really fostered a love of mysteries and science fiction in me. Uh, um, when we talked on the Patreon about Dashiell Hammett and Remy Chandler, my grandfather's one who gave me a leather-bound copy of a Dashiell Hammett novel, but he also gave me a thick book called The Illustrated Sherlock Holmes, which was the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, but they were reprinted. The layout was reprinted from the Strand magazine, so it had all of the original Paget illustrations. It was in the two-column format, like a magazine, and I read that book so many times. The book was utterly destroyed, and then I ended up a friend of mine many years later from Canada. I happened to have a copy of it and sent it to me as a gift, so I now have another copy of it again. But then like you, I kind of fell away for a while, and then it probably would have been the mid to late 90s when someone gave me some VHS tapes of the Granada series, the Jeremy Brett series, and I was like, oh yeah, no, this is amazing, and so it kind of just stuck with me ever since. So it was one of my not my very first fandom because there are other fandoms that I was a fan right from the start, like obsessed fan right from the start, Transformers in particular, but Sherlock Holmes is probably the one I've stuck with the longest in the sense of I was reading Sherlock Holmes very, very early in my life, and it's always been around, whereas other fandoms I've dipped in and out. So I
Yeah.
really, really like Sherlock Holmes, in case it's not clear.
This run is going to be Eddie's Eddie's primary like scholarship here, and I'll be learning a lot from Eddie. I am familiar with Holmes in the canon and some of the offshoots, and it's something I enjoy, but I don't love it how Eddie loves it.
Right, right. This is Chris's apology for forcing me to watch the reboot of Voltron. Is what this is.
The brilliance of that show was.
Oh God.
So then
Oh
we're
God.
going to start this off now because it may change during the course of it. Who do you prefer, Basil Rathbone or Jeremy Brett? Those are your two options. I'm not giving anybody else for right now.
Jeremy Brett, but I mean I like Jeremy Brett more, but I, I'll talk more about Rathbone because I mean we can't talk about this not talk about Rathbone. So I mean I'll talk more about Rathbone when we get there. But I will say that Rathbone is iconic, but his performance for me has not aged as well as Jeremy Brett's has.
That makes sense. Just from the periods of time in which they were acting.
Right. Hmm. How about
and
you?
what expectations were and how actors have developed their skills over the decades.
Yeah, totally. How about you? What about your opinions of Rathbone?
It would be Jeremy Brett. I like Basil Rathbone, but I also am still more used to Basil Rathbone being a swashbuckling swordsy villain than I am anything else. Even when he
I
portrayed
th-
Holmes,
he played Sinbad, right?
I was thinking more of the Danny Kaye movie right now, where he was
Oh, okay.
because we showed that to the kiddo recently,
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah,
and
very
I
fun.
can even mention that Zora's favorite Holmes sibling is Enola because
Of
she's seen
course.
both of the movies and she wants to read any of the books I'll put out.
What? Good news and bad news. There are a few Enola Holmes books, but also she's not canonical.
Eh.
Alas.
But we know from Eddie Webb that canon is irrelevant.
Right. And this is a perfect opportunity for me to explain why that is, actually. I think I told the story in the Q&A, but it's worth telling
Eddie,
here again. Yes.
Eddie, what's
What is
canon?
canon? That's where I'm going, actually. So the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle are often called canonical, specifically Captain C canonical. They are specifically the canon, and they were given that name because a priest wrote for a religious magazine in the 20s talking about Sherlock Holmes and started using references like the canon of Sherlock Holmes and comparing it to the non-canonical books of Sherlock Holmes. And if you just read the article without context, it looks like a half decent researched fan argument written in the 1920s. What the nuance of a miss is that the whole article is supposed to be a satire of theologians who rely too much on works that have been decreed to be canonical and ignoring other works that have not been decreed to be canonical. So all of the canon arguments that y'all are having today are because of a snarky priest 100 years ago decided to get shirty but wanted to hide their snark. And that's something actually it'll be interesting to see as we go forward because a lot of the things that modern fandom has, the tropes, the structures, the names, come from Sherlock Holmes, come from Sherlock Holmes fandom. Sherlock Holmes is, in a lot of ways, the first modern fandom. And jumping ahead slightly, but when Sherlock Holmes was apparently dead, people actually mourned. Like they wore armbands, black armbands. Thousands of people wore black armbands. It was national news in the UK. Subscriber numbers to the magazine that printed Sherlock Holmes stories dropped by 200,000 subscribers.
Yeah, the Strand barely survived.
Yeah, yeah. They begged Sir Arthur to come back and write more stories.
And he said, "Fuck you, I'm done. I'm only writing about dinosaurs."
Well, actually, originally it was, I'm only going to write about knights, and then he's like, and then I'm only write about dinosaurs, and then it's like I guess I'll take the money.
What?
Speaking
You
of which,
mean that artists will suddenly decide that money is important to them and give up their artistic freedom and write what people want them to write if it's enough?
yes,
Speaking of which, if
absolutely
you're willing to donate to the podcast, a simple $10 million will cover nearly anything you'd want us to.
right.
Still, I can't see
Nearly,
how I kept the caveat nearly.
very very important. Yes,
But you got to pay us first, and we'll decide.
actually, that is a nice segue. Though we should probably well, yours wasn't. My attempt was. I
Hmm.
mean, we should probably talk about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle because he was the original author of Sherlock Holmes, and he originally was a medical student in Scotland. He tried to set up his own optometry practice, I'm pretty sure. Did not do very well. And so decided he wanted to become a writer instead because that's where the money was at. It was
So
Victorian times.
wait. You have a tendency to
Yes,
jump midway into a story.
I
I don't want
know.
to know that part about Doyle. I want to know how Doyle, who were his parents? How did Doyle grow up? Was he a rich kid? Was he poor? Was his dad good, bad? Was the mom like kicking it? How did they get by? What is the story of young Arthur Conan Doyle, Eddie? Don't give me like Doyle as an adult. Give me the lead up. You're a writer. Give me like the opening, the middle, and the end.
I would if this were a podcast about Conan Doyle, but it is not. It's a podcast about Sherlock Holmes, so we're going to start when he was working on Sherlock Holmes.
But we can't be a podcast about Sherlock Holmes unless we know the true origins of Arthur Conan Doyle. Like, for instance, I'm assuming some of his characters are based on people that were important in his life. Perhaps some of those were when he in his childhood. Perhaps some of those are university professors. Who would know, Eddie?
I was literally about to go there when you cut me off to do this bullshit segue to bring me back to the
But
point I was gonna make.
I'm going to once again derail you from this bullshit way you're going because you're skipping over his potentially troubled childhood that influenced the characters and his drive for making the stories that he's making, which are all pertinent.
I feel like you know more about Conan Doyle than I perhaps do at this point because you're alluding some stuff, but his early childhood and stuff is currently eluding me because I've not read his biography in about a decade. So why don't you go ahead and fill in those gaps?
The little bit that I know, I believe he had a troubled childhood. And I want to say, if I remember right, potentially his father either killed his mother or there was some sort of altercation like that. The mom went
No,
somewhere else.
he didn't kill his mother. His mom was around for a good long time.
I said if I remembered, which I'm spotty, but I do
Okay.
remember troubled childhood. I think the mother moved, potentially remarried someone else that lived with them, and some of those people that were interacting became influences for characters that he makes later. And like, it's been a while, decades since I've looked into it, but all of
Yeah.
that is pertinent to the stories of Holmes. So
His
I
dad,
make
his dad just
jokes,
spent
but
time in jail. Yes.
much like you, I'm also a bit of a scholar. I make a lot of more jokes about it, but all that does influence the work. And so that's why I want to talk about that, is that's where the work comes from and people understand the process of creating.
No, that is fair. His father did spend time in jail. And that did he became very much what we now call a mama's boy in the sense that he doted on his mother and his mother doted on him. And that is a relevant point. I do agree with that. So I'll come up in a minute here. But also he was a very typical Victorian gentleman in the sense that he was both athletic and also valued the mind. So he liked sports and wanted to be a doctor. And these were not seen to be incompatible goals for someone of his standing. His family was relatively wealthy. They didn't really have the concept of middle class quite yet at the time he grew up, but he would have been what you'd probably now call middle class because he was not gentry, he was not nobility, he was not rich, but certainly he was fairly well off. He could go to a decent private school, which apparently was miserable for him. And then he went to University of Edinburgh. I don't remember exactly. I know it's in Edinburgh, but I don't know the actual remember the name of the university he went to for medical school. And then I don't think he actually had war service. I was about to say he did, but I don't think he actually ever did do war service. But he did become an optometrist. And then he's always had a desire to write. And specifically, he had a desire to write historical novels. And so his plan was he would dash off some cheap adventure stories, make a little cash, learn how to write well, and then leverage that into writing more important historical books.
The dream of so many of us.
Right. Which is super interesting because his very first book is 50% Sherlock Holmes and 50% random Mormon nonsense. Which is why we will not be talking about Eddy and Scarlet today because it is really, really badly researched. If you ever wonder when so many American writers try to write like Japanese or Asian history or even modern day culture, if you guess what that probably looks like, as an American, go read the second half of Eddy and Scarlet and see what a British man using almost no research thinks America looked like at the time, and you get a kind of a sense of how that feels because it's bad. It's bad.
I'm going to defend it like to a half step. You're inferring it's badly researched. for all we know, given the time he was in and the access he had, it could have been as well researched as he could do at that point in time.
I would assume that if I had not read an entire book of his published letters where he flat out says, I did not bother to research this.
Oh, I love it.
Which is one of the fascinating things about Doyle, is, like I said, he was very much, he and his mother had a very close relationship. So he would often write to his mother and to other contemporaries, and save all of his letters. So we do have a fairly good documentation of his thought process from early on in his life to fairly late in his life. And one of them was that initially he was very pleased with the success of Sherlock Holmes, but very quickly became very disenchanted with it, and felt like it was getting in the way of his quote-unquote real work, which was to write historical books, which he did. He eventually wrote The White Company, and it is terrible. I like Doyle. I like a lot of his work. The White Company is a slog. And then he decided to go back to writing important stuff like Professor Challenger discovering dinosaurs in Africa, because that's a thing that can happen.
Well,
And,
dinosaurs are everywhere.
Right.
They just kind of pop up.
Boop. Yeah, just, there's little pockets of Africa where just, evolution works differently.
You said Africa. I'm saying they're everywhere. They could like pop up in your backyard. They could be like cruising along. It's because
in your
there
car.
are these little temporal portals that appear all over Earth at any random point in time, and they're all linked to prehistoric dinosaur times, and dinos just boop, pop out.
That's right. I have also seen dinosaurs in a spaceship.
We may have been talking about Doctor Who before recording today.
Because we don't talk. If we thought we'd done talking about Doctor Who after that run of Genreless. No, we probably always talking about Doctor Who.
We're just sharing the conversations for a little bit.
Right.
Because we have to talk about Sherlock Holmes and the life of Arthur Conan Doyle.
Right. And then, kind of a long story short at that point, Tom, is he tries to kill off Sherlock Holmes, doesn't, comes back to it, gets offered a staggering amount of cash to write Sherlock Holmes, which he takes. And
I'd push back on that and say that he killed off Sherlock Holmes. He was offered a staggering amount of cash, and then he resurrected Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Because we'll get there, but that story that Holmes tells about how he avoided death.
Oh yeah, it's bullshit. That's actually why I chose it, because it's like, and that's entirely fair. I am glossing over that. Yes, no, he absolutely tried to kill off Holmes definitively. The British public simply just didn't accept it, and then a truckload of cash 10 years later convinced him to undo that. Even Hound of the Baskervilles, one of the most well-known novels, was written because it was just purely for the money. He's like, okay, I'm not going to unkill him, but I'll do an adventure before he died just to take the money. And then that didn't take. So finally he had to unkill him and come up with a bullshit story.
And I want all of you people right now to know that for any television series or movie series that you love and you want the next version of it, the reason they make prequels is because Arthur Conan Doyle was an asshole to take a cash grab. It's all Doyle's fault.
Yep.
You don't like the prequel to something? Blame Arthur Conan Doyle.
Legit. Besides the fact that Hound of the Baskervilles is one of the most well-known stories of Sherlock Holmes canon, which is hilarious because Holmes is barely in it.
I'm not saying that he did it badly. I'm saying the premise of doing it is him. The execution is of each individual production company.
Right. Yeah, there wasn't really the concept of a prequel before then. Yeah, totally.
So, Eddie, does that mean that Arthur Conan Doyle created the first detective in fiction?
Not entirely. Actually, I had this conversation recently. Detectives in fiction existed beforehand. There is some debate on who the very first one is, but a lot of people agree that Poe actually beat Doyle to the punch, at least, with Auguste Dupin, who was in 2 stories?
I think it's 3.
Okay.
It's 3. Because he has different motivations in all 3 of them, and I always thought that was weird.
Yeah. And France had Inspector Lecoq, I believe, before Doyle. It was either
That
before or
I'm
right around the
super
time.
fuzzy. I'm fuzzy on that one. And I think there was
Because
one more popularized one too before that.
right, it's a bit muddy because one thing we can say is that Doyle's the first person to codify the mystery structure. Because the stories before that are better classified as crime by modern parlance. Like for example, the Poe stories are really just horror stories where the detective stumbles into a horror situation and maybe kind of solves it, but really it's just more of Poe's kind of horror drama, dread stories, just a slightly different
So,
structure.
in short, you're saying the best stories because they're horror stories.
It's not incorrect, but it's basically Poe was like, I want to tell horror stories. I'm going to use detective main character. Blanking on the writer for the Lecoq stories. Basically, was like, I want to tell crime stories with the detective as lead character. Doyle said, I want to tell adventure stories with the detective as lead character. And so a lot of the early stories are really adventure stories. But pretty quickly, Doyle realizes that people are actually wanting to be cleverer than Holmes. That's kind of the game people are playing with the stories. They want to try to figure out the answer before Holmes does. And so he starts to codify what we now recognize as the mystery structure, although he does not actually finalize it. Agatha Christie is the person who actually finalizes the mystery structure into the structure we know today, because she's interested in the concept of playing fair and making it more explicitly a game with the reader. Doyle takes it 80% of the way there, and really it is her that finishes it off. But
Can we take a slight pivot? Because on the Patreon episode, you really delved into some of this. I think it's important if we're into the Sherlock Holmes series. Can you tell us about the different types of mysteries? Because you mentioned Doyle writing and then Agatha Christie doing something where people play fair. What do you mean by
right,
that?
that's
Like,
fair. That's fair. Okay, so I can take a step backwards then. So Doyle starts creating, let's call them mysteries. That's basically kind of the default mystery. It's still prototypical, but it is there. Then around the early 20s, when Doyle had started wrapping up writing, we get to kind of rough detective traditions. And very reductively, it is the American and British traditions. There's also a French tradition, but it's done primarily around criminals, and so it's kind of a different take. So that's kind of where our heist model comes from, is really from the Lupin and all of his successors model, but it's still kind of in the mystery area. It's very different. But basically, it boils down to um, what we kind of now call, what used to be called drawing room mysteries, are now kind of called cozy mysteries, and what we now called hard-boiled or noir mysteries. And really, what those two mean is you have Agatha Christie drawing room mysteries are mystery as puzzle. The idea that the characters and the setting are really there to kind of just put the pieces of the puzzle in place, and you want to what's called play fair with the reader, which is that you want to put all the evidence and all the information into the story before the detective reveals it. And so the reader could theoretically read the story and figure out who solved it before they get to the end. Um, this is where the trope of flipping to the back of the book and reading the last few pages kind of comes from, is because people who don't want to play fair, they want to just check to see if their answer is right. And that kind of, and Agatha Christie really popularizes that specific model. The other side, the American detective side, is much more about the characters. It's what we now kind of, again, more commonly call crime novels, but it's about, can you figure out who is telling the truth in this scenario, and then following this web of deceit, uncover the biggest liar and therefore probably the key of the criminal in the mystery. So it doesn't necessarily tell you all of the evidence of the mystery, but it will give you all of the things that people say so you can decide for yourself who's telling the truth, who's lying. So in a very reductive way, the two versions are you playing the evidence or are you playing the people from the detective tradition? And from there, it gets more complex and nuanced and muddier, and what constitutes crime and fiction is now just a huge ball of mess. But both of those traditions ultimately do stem from Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes has elements of both of those in his stories, but none of them, well, very few of them play fair. Holmes very frequently just withholds information from the reader.
Do you have a preferred one of those?
I do read a lot of both. So, but I have a slight preference towards the hard-boiled tradition, just because as I get older, I find character-driven fiction a little more interesting than plot-driven fiction. And really, on some level, that's the two breakdown. Agatha Christie style is kind of plot-driven. The Dashiell Hammett style, if you will, Raymond Chandler style, is more character-driven. And so I find those more interesting. But that is, I will read either of those pretty easily, and have read a lot of both of them. Surprisingly, not as much Agatha Christie. As much as I talk about her, I've only written a couple of her novels. I just know a lot about the kinds of novels there, and I've watched like movies and interpretations and whatnot. So I'm familiar, but I've actually not read many of them. I really should get back on that. But
Thank you for
the,
mentioning. Sorry, slight
but
tangent. Thank you for mentioning that. Something that we should have mentioned at the top of the show is that the time period in which these were written, you need to prepare yourself for specific language, stereotypes, and other insulting things for modern sensibilities and for different groups of people.
yes, although I will say for Victorian fiction, Doyle's fiction ages generally really well. Um, uh, there's a lot of times, and even on this podcast, we've been like, this thing's 50 years old, 60 years old, 70 years old. Be careful for it. These stories are over 100, sometimes 140 years old, and you don't need as many qualifiers for them, I find.
I agree, and that's why it didn't really ping on my radar until you mentioned Agatha Christie,
Right.
and that's when
Agatha
I
Christie
want
has
to make
aged
sure
less
that
well, yes.
we put a big, massive like foot stomp that is something to consider before you read these and pick them up. When you
Right,
see, if you look at the movies and some of the more updated versions of the books, they've been updated with different sensibilities and not always modern sensibilities. That's why I say different, not necessarily modern, depending on which version you're reading or watching.
right. I will say, though, that in this case, some of this is not just by accident. Doyle was famously anti-racist to the point where, long story short, it's actually a fascinating case, and I encourage people to look it up. But an Indian college student was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. Everyone assumed he was guilty. The investigation was horribly botched, and Doyle openly and repeatedly not only campaigned publicly in the papers against him, offered his own services for free to support him, but also put his own money to the kid's defense, and openly called the London police racist in his interviews. And because he was Conan Doyle, got a lot of visibility on the case that would not otherwise have been seen. He absolutely leveraged his celebrity to try to get this kid from being falsely accused.
So, Eddie, I think I know what you're saying and what you mean, but this is also in America. Can you state what country or what background the student came from?
Oh, he was born in the UK, but he was of Indian descent.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry,
To
I
avoid
didn't clarify
any,
that. Yeah, and the case was in the UK. And
because Eddie's a UK citizen now, and he forgets that us Americans are still super, super stupid and racist.
well, don't trust me, the UK is still stupid fucking racist. Don't get me wrong. It's not gone away. The fact that this was 100 years ago and this was what was happening. I mean, yes, there are some people who, of course, were like, "You're using your celebrity to shove politics down my throat." That was happening even in the 20s, right? That still happens today.
Happens today.
But the point is that the few times that Doyle stumbles in, at least at Sherlock Holmes' work, it is usually because either terminologies have shifted or just purely out of ignorance. He was one of the first people to introduce the idea of a mixed race marriage in fiction. So I mean, yeah, he was really pushing boundaries, which were very rare for the time. So
And one of the other things is that he also went out of his way to introduce people to new groups and concepts, and I think provide some context for them, hopefully more well researched. For instance, I know that in some of his stories, I want to say that he even brought in the KKK before.
yep,
For people
he
that
did.
don't know who that vile organization is, it should be put down like rabid dogs.
Right, and they were explicitly and intentionally positioned as villains in that story, which is again something
As
that
they
did not
are.
consistently happen. Right, right, but at that time did not consistently happen.
So we've gone on. We could probably go on for at least another hour, but we should get to
That,
the actual stories we're going to cover. Before we do that, though, Eddie, who is Sherlock Holmes based on, if you know, and
oh,
what
right.
super skills does Holmes have? Subtangent to that, who is Watson and what super skills does Watson have? Subtangent, who the fuck cares about Lestrade? Please go.
I'm mad because I yelled at you for digressing me from that topic and then immediately didn't go to that topic. Yes, Sherlock Holmes is heavily inspired by one of Doyle's professors, known as Dr. Bell. I think it's James Bell. I actually forget the first name. But one of his instructors were often able to just look at people and diagnose them by his observation of their physical appearance, and that extrapolated to being able to deduce things about their occupation and standing in health and society class. And so he would often do this supposedly as a tool to help students learn how to correctly diagnose people, but pretty quickly it became a parlor trick. And so that's where Sherlock Holmes's initial conception kind of came from. Watson, hilariously, is largely based on Doyle himself, even though Doyle has frequently and on film called Watson a stupid fellow. So there's something going on in Doyle's head there. But Watson is
You know
a
what?
doctor who went into the military, which Doyle wanted to do, and was active in school and did sports.
Self-deprecation, Eddie, is the highest form of self-flattery for brilliant people.
Right, exactly. And also, the only thing I'll say about Lestrade at this point is, to this day, to this moment, 2024, there is still a lot of debate whether it is pronounced Lestrade or Lestrade. So there you go.
Then my sub bullet. Where are the Baker Street irregulars? Huh?
Not in these stories that we're going to talk about.
That's it. I could go on for like another 30 minutes, but
Trust me, we have lots of episodes to go into all of these nuances, and we probably will. But since this is the only time we're going to really talk about Doyle directly, it made sense to kind of focus on him. But if you have any more sub digressions, we'll go into the first story.
one more then. Well, no, I'm joking. Go ahead.
Okay. So we're going to start with The Speckled Band, which is listed as Conan Doyle's favorite story.
Actually, why did you choose these three stories and not different ones before we
Okay.
go into the stories themselves?
But, well, the first one I already kind of covered is Speckled Band is Conan Doyle's favorite story. It's the one he repeatedly throughout his life cited as he felt it was his best work. It's also, between this and The Hound of the Baskervilles, probably one of the most iconic stories. A lot of our conceptions of Holmes, Watson, and the Holmes and Watson relationship comes from a small handful of stories, of which Speckled Band is one. It's part of the first collection of stories, which are probably also the ones that most people are familiar with. Is the original Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So I wanted to cover at least one story in that first volume, and so picking Doyle's is a good one. Not my favorite, but if it's the author's favorite, it's worth examining. The other two, The Final Problem and The Adventure of the Empty House, are just because it's the story where Doyle tried to kill off Holmes and the story where he reluctantly had to bring Holmes back. But also, that is the introduction of the other kind of big chunk of the mythos, which is Moriarty. Those are the two that really cover Moriarty in real depth. Moriarty's mentioned in 5 stories, but these are the only 2 where he has a meaningful impact on the story. So it's worth kind of touching those because that's the other big chunk of the mythology.
One last question.
No, it's time for the last
Are
question.
Holmes and Watson in a relationship?
They're friends?
No.
So, okay. I could do a whole
We
sub episode about the fascinating queering of Holmes and Watson and whether Holmes and Watson are in a homosexual relationship, whether Holmes is actually asexual, whether Watson is bisexual or heterosexual, how that relationship ties to Holmes and Watson's separate relationships with women and how the canon presents them. There's a lot there to unpack. Um, so I'm just going to say, like many things in fandom, the Sherlock Holmes fandom is actually one of the first places that not only for fan fiction exists, but also specifically slash fiction. The idea of queering Holmes and Watson does go back for quite a long ways, probably at least the 50s or 60s. That's not an uncommon thing. And so queering 2 male characters, putting them into a homosexual or queer relationship at least, does kind of stem from the Sherlock Holmes fandom as well. So again, we got there first.
All right, please go ahead. Giving Doyle all his kudos that he's building.
Right.
So go ahead.
Okay. So in April 1883, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson rise early one morning to meet a young woman named Helen Stoner, who fears that her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, is threatening her life. She explains that Roylott is a violent doctor of great physical strength who practiced in Calcutta, India. He is the impoverished sole survivor of a wealthy but ill-tempered and amoral aristocratic Anglo-Saxon family in Surrey, and was married to Helen's late mother, a wealthy widow, 30 years prior. After serving time in an Indian prison for killing his Indian butler in a rage, Roylott had moved to England to re-establish his practice, but retired after his wife was killed in a railway accident 8 years prior. Furthermore, Helen's twin sister Julia died 2 years prior, shortly before her wedding day. Despite hearing her last words, "the speckled band," Helen cannot make sense of them. Now that she is engaged, she has also begun hearing strange noises and observing strange activities around her heavily mortgaged countryside home of Stoke Moran, while Roylott has made extensive modifications to even before Julia's death. Of particular note, he is having an outside wall repaired, forcing Helen to move into the room where Julia died. After Holmes agrees to take the case, he is visited by Roylott, who threatens to harm him if he interferes. Undaunted, Holmes leaves for the courthouse to examine Helen's mother's will before joining Watson and traveling to Stoke Moran, where he scrutinizes the premises. Within Helen's room, he discovers her bed is anchored to the floor, an unconnected bell cord has been installed, and a ventilator hole connects her room to Roylott's. Holmes and Watson arrange to stay the night in Helen's room. At 3 a.m., a slight metallic noise and a dim light through the ventilator prompts Holmes to light a candle. He soon sees the quote-unquote speckled band, which is a venomous snake, on the bell cord and strikes it with his riding crop. Agitated, it flies back through the ventilator and kills Roylott instead, who has sent it to kill Helen and was awaiting its return. Holmes identifies the snake as an Indian swamp adder and reveals to Watson that the will initially provided an annual income of £1,100, which is a lot of money in 1880s money, before dropping to £750 when she died, of which her daughters could claim 1/3 upon marriage. Desiring all the income for himself, Roylott schemed to murder his daughters. Though Holmes also admits to indirectly killing Roylott, he does not foresee it troubling him and chooses not to tell the police Roylott's full motive to spare Helen any further grief. So, what did you think of this story?
As I've read it and I've seen it, I thought it was pretty good. It is not my favorite by any means.
Right. That's kind of where I'm at too. I mean, in terms of iconography, it's a good representative example of traditional Sherlock Holmes. It is Holmes and Watson. They are living together in Baker Street.
Yeah, they
They
are.
they are yeah they are. I don't check it out. They
So I'm going to pause you
yep.
on my stance because I didn't get into it. I am a staunch believer that Holmes and Watson are in an open relationship, and that is how they go. That is why Watson is constantly distraught when Holmes potentially when Holmes perish more than a friendship. It's also why they each have their own thing potentially with, for Sherlock, the woman, and so forth and so on. But that is a larger conversation we can have at some other
Yes,
point in time.
fair enough.
I feel like that's a whole episode in of itself.
It is, and I do want to dig into it maybe later on in the series, because I have slightly different thoughts. They're not entirely incompatible with that. But actually, that is a good point because in this story, we do have a moment of Holmes expressing concern for Watson's safety, which is a pretty early example of that. That is an ongoing trend because the Watson Holmes relationship is fascinating. I think one of the reasons why it's endured is because it is fascinating. Holmes frequently puts his friend in danger, but it is always framed like because he feels Watson can take care of himself, and that's what this story is kind of digs into very very briefly. Is that Holmes is like, I'm worried about you, and Watson's like, whatever, bro, let's do. And so I, I'm in the military. I have a gun. This is fine. That's kind of how it all plays out.
So while we did skim over the origins of how they met together, it is good to know that Watson did serve in war and was more than just a doctor. He was like a veteran doctor who fought in the war himself and was injured and came back home. And it's because the injury is why he's no longer in the service. So that's important to note about the character, is that they're a soldier, but they're not in a war because of that injury, but they're on the mend. So that's why sometimes you can have Watson be dynamic and other times have them not be as dynamic, because it could be like a
Right.
war wound flaring up, which I think is a brilliant conceit. And it was also one that I stole when I wrote Langston Wright for Cthulhu Confidential. To have my own war vet that has an
Ah,
injury, and so you can be amazingly dynamic and suddenly can't be because of the war wound. I love it. I love it.
it's great. Although, and this is mostly for you because I know you're a history fan. I went to a Sherlock Holmes convention. Of course, I did. But one of the talks was actually from a historian talking about how British military structures worked at this time frame. And one of the things that he talked about, which was really, or sorry, she talked about, which is really cool, is that how doctors were not actually part of the military. They were given honorary equivalent ranks, but they were not
Mm-hmm.
a part of the military. They did fight alongside them, but they're not given full commissions. And so when Watson was invalided out, one of the reasons why he's talking about how he has no money is because he doesn't actually get a military pension.
I
So
love that.
it was fascinating because it's like, oh, okay, so that explains why he doesn't really like ever call up his military friends or talk with them, is because he's not technically part of the military.
And so for people that think that that's a raw deal for Watson, I want you to then take that knowledge and information to know that most of the black soldiers that fought in like World War One and the Civil War and everything else did not receive military pensions and stipends how the other white soldiers did during the war. So they
Hmm.
came back and they had nothing. So think about that for history and how it actually is in Dole's writing, but it also is taken from the real world.
Yeah, yeah. There's some interesting parallels there. In fact, has led some people to argue that Watson could very possibly have been black, and it's an interesting piece of evidence to nothing in the stories contradict that reading. It's interesting. But
You
anyway,
know, if I were ever to write Sherlock Holmes and Watson would be black.
and Watson was black in that book's Irregulars, so
So
which is why I know this conversation because I had to get onto some forums and explain to people how history works, which is always an uphill battle for these kinds of conversations. But anyway,
okay.
but yes.
Mm.
So I mean, in
Before
terms
we
of
get back
okay,
into it, one last thing. we skimmed over it, but do you remember what Sherlock's fields of studies are, like his strengths and weaknesses? Because that is just a good thing to know up top. If you don't, we can get it before next episode. Like how he was
Um,
great in history, but like weak in other things, because it's laid out in that first story. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm not gonna lie.
well,
So
okay, so we just skip over a study in Scarlet, and there's a few reasons why I did that. One, because again, really bad Mormon research, but also there's a lot of stuff that's established there, but doesn't actually pan out, right? Because in that first story, for example, the scene where Chris is referring to is that when Watson first becomes Holmes's roommate, he starts documenting the strange fields of study that Holmes seems to be prevalent in, and also the weird gaps in his knowledge. So he says things like, knowledge of popular culture, nil. Knowledge of chemistry, phenomenal, but in very specialized forms. No knowledge of astronomy, but massive knowledge in sensational literature, and so on and so forth. But like at the time, he says that Holmes has no knowledge of religion or popular music, when both those things are proved to be not true in later stories. It says Holmes has no knowledge of astronomy, but is also aware of Moriarty's treatise on the dynamics of an asteroid. So this leads me to the Great Game, which I have to explain briefly. The Great Game, which is something that the Great Game refers to the conceit that people studying Sherlock Holmes stories decide that everything Sherlock Holmes says is historically accurate, and therefore tries to reconcile actual history with the canon of the stories and prove it to be one seamless whole. It is not. This is a fool's errand, and that's part of the fun. So sometimes you have to talk about whether something is playing the Great Game or not playing the Great Game. So some analysis does play the Great Game, some doesn't, and it can be hard to determine which is which. But if you are playing the game, assuming that all the stories are true and are a consistent chronology, is that Watson did not correctly observe some of Holmes's understandings and made some assumptions about his areas of knowledge. If you're not playing the Great Game, Doyle didn't give a fuck because he wasn't really paying attention to what would happen after his shirt's first story sold.
I would suggest that Holmes acquired the other knowledges as he needed them, because that is the type of character he is.
Maybe there is one of the stories is referencing prequels. There's one story where he tells Watson a story of his first case before he met Watson, where he was at a college that was undefined. And he references that he took an eclectic field of study, certainly, but he did mention that he did do a lot of studying. So it's vague, suffice to say.
As well it should be.
But relevance to this story is that Holmes talks about how specialized his brain is, and so we see that in the stories that he has an encyclopedic knowledge of whatever the plot demands, to be honest. But it does tend to be around very outre. So he's very familiar with poisons and what animals can be poisonous or venomous. He, very knowledgeable about, architecture and structure as it relates to potentially nefarious schemes. In the original canon, there's not much that he isn't knowledgeable about if it is relevant to the plot. The only blind spot that we find consistently in the story, and we do see that a little bit in this story, is people. Holmes does not have what we like to call these days soft skills. From a modern perspective, he seems to have a fair amount of them, but from a Victorian perspective, he doesn't. So the encounter with Stoke Moran, for example, if someone's coming and threatening you, laughing at them is probably not the best path forward to diffuse that.
I wish you told me that last week.
Yeah, and here we are, be bailing you out of jail again. But it is also a very classic Sherlock Holmes moment, right? Is the Sherlock Holmes no sells this guy being mad at him, very politely tells him the door, and then casually just unbends an iron poker because that's what you do.
All right. So before we get there, how did you like when she comes in and they have the initial conversation with Julia, and she's sort of describing her problem, and Holmes is already putting all the pieces together.
I think it's a good, again, representative example of the traditional structure, right? Is that a client comes in, he dazzles them with an early piece of deduction to prove his bona fides. They explain the story. He puts some pieces in place, but holds some information back from Watson and therefore the audience. But it's clear that he sees something interesting in this case that Watson and therefore we are not seeing. Um, it's also surprisingly more relevant than people realize that a lot of people have this idea that Holmes just knows the answer and is just going through the motions the rest of the story. That's actually not true in most of the stories. And we kind of see that in this setup is that he knows that something is up enough to make him go look up the will, right? Which is not the first thing you would do. First thing you just go to the scene of the crime or a potential crime and investigate it. Instead, he's like, nope, there's something wrong with this arrangement. Let me check the will. Okay, yes, there's something hinky about this relationship. I've established motive for Moran. Now let's go look at the actual scene of the crime.
And I'm going to make it another gaming tangent. For gamers out there, if you're in a mystery or investigative game, what you're seeing Holmes do here, in my opinion, is the best route to take. Like, you don't
Mm-hmm.
immediately necessarily go to where the event's going to happen. You research the event and you find out some information about it that'll help inform theories that you're making. As a writer, that is something that I always include when I'm writing mystery stuff, because I like to have those other pieces so you get a whole.
Right. To this story's, I don't want to say detriment, but the wild twists and turns that mysteries are kind of known for now are not in many of the Holmes stories. So, like, even if you're not familiar with the story, if you're reading this for the first time, it's still pretty clear who the villain is, right? It's like the murderer literally shows up and threatens Holmes. He's the only character we don't like in the whole story, and there are four characters. Two of them are Holmes and Watson. You know, I wonder who the person could possibly be. And there's vague digressions of like, there's a cheetah and a orangutan on the property, and there are these travelers that camp on the property. It's like, but they're so obviously not intended to be serious digressions from the story. We know Stoke Moran did it, so it's more for kind of a Columbo style mystery of how did he do it.
But that's the brilliance of the story. Like, while it
Mm-hmm.
is not one of my favorites, you they can't just move Julia out of the house. Julia needs some money, so she's still stuck living in that house with this person that's potentially trying to kill her.
Yep.
Holmes and Watson know that, but they don't know how. They don't know how they're going to save her, and they need to find the proof and then have it be believable because of the society that they're in. There are certain things that she would die before she broke that societal mold. So it's
Right.
all pressure that's there, so it doesn't need to have all the extra little hootenannies that we have in modern storytelling.
Right. Because societal structures provide some of the pressure that in modern stories we have to manufacture in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the reasons why I like this story is because Holmes doesn't begrudge that. But again, we have this modern perception that Holmes only cares about the puzzle, and that's true. But from a Victorian perspective, Holmes can't be that brusque. He has to show a certain amount of concern for his clients because that's what you do. And so he's clearly concerned about Julia, but it is Watson who's kind of nudging Holmes occasionally, be like, maybe we should go to reassure her. You know, maybe we should find a way to meet up with her. It doesn't involve meeting up with the stepfather, which admittedly immediately fails, but they couldn't possibly predicted that. Watson is the emotional intelligence of the pair, and you see glimmers of that in the story.
And to your point about when he comes in and he bends a poker and sort of throws it aside, Holmes bends it back. Now, do you think that Holmes is able to bend it back from pure strength or from knowing the right pressure points to apply to the poker? Which is it, Eddie?
I was
I
gonna
got
save I was gonna save Baritsu for the third story, but since we're here, all right, fucking Baritsu. So Baritsu doesn't exist, right? Bartitsu does. And Bartitsu exists because a British guy saw martial arts and decided to make up a whole new martial art and claim it was ancient Japanese art. It is the Taibo of Victorian martial arts. It's just made up nonsense. And Doyle says, that sounds cool. I saw a sign for that once. I forgot how it's spelled. I think it's something like this. Wrote it down and said, this is Japanese wrestling. It was never wrestling. It's stick fighting. It's the original one, actually. But even better is that no one ever accused Donald Coyle of making shit up. So a lot of pulp magazines in the 30s and 40s assumed, oh yeah, Baritsu's totally a real thing, and started giving it to their characters. So Doc Savage knew Baritsu, the Shadow knew Baritsu. There's another detective, I think it was Johnny Dollar, knew Baritsu, and it's just like, and so now here we are 100 years later, and people are like, we have nerds trying to reverse engineer what Baritsu could be, in the same way that people look at old Star Trek episodes and go, okay, let's make an actual martial art out of all the Jim Kirk fighting scenes. Because nerds are amazing.
It would only have been better if Jessica Fletcher knew Baritsu.
Right.
All right, we can move ahead if you want. I had to come back to touch on that. I couldn't help myself.
God, yeah. But I mean, it is a good note also because Holmes's physical abilities are something that are often downplayed in media adaptations, except for extremely recently. But Holmes was physically fit. In another story, he was a boxing champion. In another story, he was a strong athlete at his college. Although, again, very specialized in defense arts, which were not really a thing in British society at the time. So seeing Doyle grasping at martial arts is actually understandable given the fact that that just wasn't really a concept beyond boxing at the time.
And we know because we saw Robert Downey Jr., who was the best Holmes, do a little boxing in those movies.
I will defend those movies, actually, because on some levels they are the most authentic, because they do hit the spirit of the stories in a lot of ways that other adaptations don't, including beating a guy down to get information out of him. Not so much with the Mycroft running around naked, but anyway.
What did you think of the speckled band once it was revealed?
It's dumb.
Again,
there is no such thing as an Indian swamp adder. It doesn't exist. No snake is so venomous that it kills someone instantly. Snakes can't hear. They don't have ears. They don't drink milk. None of this makes a lick of sense. But we are fans of Doctor Who, and we can embrace a certain amount of things not making sense.
Or that goes right back and bites him. Yeah.
No, that's because okay. So it goes through the hole and comes down the rope. It gets chased back up the rope. That fine. Actually, the vibration chasing the snake back up. That actually is the only part that makes any sense in this. So he goes back to the hole, and then what? Jumps to hit Rorlot. Uses snakes.
I envision Rorlot going over to try to grab his snake, and the snake being aggravated because Holmes whacked at it.
I just figured like a cartoon just turned into a coil and bounced off the wall. Because why not?
I too remember the Jungle Book.
Right? No, it's a rubbish ending. It really is.
Agreed. The ending is what really ruins this for me. Otherwise, I'd have a higher opinion of it. It's not bad. It's just not one of my favorites.
I look at it as a first draft version of the end of Hound of the Baskervilles, because it's another story where an animal is manipulated and doing murder, and the murderer ultimately gets killed by that animal that they used. Hound does it way better. But this is just kind of a first draft attempt at that, and it is not good.
Well, of course, because the Hound is like a military experiment that they just stumble upon.
We have to talk about that series at some point. Oh, Jesus.
Nothing but Holmes jokes all the time.
Yes, you can reference all of them. So yeah, so speckled bands. I can see why Doyle likes it so highly. I can see why a lot of people consider speckled band very highly because again, there's a lot of the classic template here. You can look at this and go, yes, that's exactly what I think a Sherlock Holmes story should be. But the thing is that there are just frankly better stories. And I've always felt that Doyle's more experimental stories are the stronger ones, and we have two of those coming up. So there you go.
If before we hit those, if someone was looking for a different story to read, what would you recommend from that book? I think that was like the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. If you had to
Yeah,
pick one for the adventures,
yeah. I recommend either The Blue Carbuncle, which is my personal favorite. It's a Christmas story. It's about a jewel theft. It shows both Holmes and Watson at in a really good inductive things, and it's pretty low stakes at the end of the day. I mean, a goose gets killed, but what can you do? Or I've just blanked on it. The one with Irene Adler, very first story. I don't know why I'm
Scanlan
blanking on it.
Bohemia.
It's gonna Bohemia. Thank you. That's the other one I recommend because if for no other reason, I mean, obviously it has Irene Adler, the other big piece of the canon. You can see that, and you can see Holmes straight up lose, which is important. But also you get to see Holmes talk shit to a king, which is just fantastic. Do
Very nice.
you have any personal favorites out of the early canon?
If I remember right, you said my first choice was the Blue Carbuncle, but I want to say the Red-Headed League. I think is also in
Ooh,
the
it's a
adventures.
good one. Yeah, it's a good one too. There's I think a few stories that basically come down to Holmes stumbles into a scam artist. So those are fun. The Clark is another good one too. Anyway, frankly, the volume of the first event, the Adventures, is actually pretty. Amusingly, I feel Speckled Band's actually one of the weakest stories in the Adventures, but also all of the Adventures come with qualifiers. This is the one that most straightforwardly just a classic Sherlock Holmes story.
Awesome. So, what is the final problem?
Final problem is how Doyle can keep making money. Right. Anyway, final problem is an injured Holmes arrives at Watson's residence one evening, having escaped 3 separate murder attempts that day. Holmes reveals to Watson he's been tracking Moriarty and his organization for months, who are responsible for most of the crimes orchestrated in London. As Holmes is close to snaring them all and delivering them to the police, Moriarty visits Holmes at 221B Baker Street earlier that day and warns him to withdraw from his pursuit of justice against him. Holmes admits that Moriarty could thwart his plans given his great mind that could rival his, and plans to flee to Europe while the police capture Moriarty and his gang on Monday. Watson decides to join Holmes on the trip. Holmes then gives him unusual instructions intended to hide his tracks to the boat train at Victoria Station before leaving Watson's home by climbing over the back wall of the garden, paranoid that he might be being followed. Next day, Watson follows Holmes' instructions and finds himself waiting in the reserved first-class coach for his friend, who is disguised as an elderly Italian priest. As the boat train pulls out of Victoria, Holmes spots Moriarty on the platform trying to stop the train. Despite extraordinary precautions, Holmes deduces that Moriarty has tracked Watson. Changing their planned route, Holmes and Watson alight at Canterbury, allowing Moriarty to board in a special one-coach train to pass them as they hide behind the luggage. Having made their way to Strasbourg via Brussels, Holmes receives a message from the London police that most of Moriarty gangs have been arrested in London, but Moriarty has escaped the dragnet and is in pursuit of Holmes in Europe. He urges Watson to return to England as he considers himself a very dangerous companion. Watson, however, decides to stay with his friend. Holmes and Watson continue to Maringien, Switzerland, and visit the Reichenbach Falls. At the falls, a boy hands Watson a letter saying there's a dying Englishwoman at the hotel who seeks an English doctor. While Holmes realizes this is a hoax, he allows Watson to see the patient. Watson soon realizes the trick when returning to the hotel and rushes back to the falls. He only finds 2 sets of footprints that lead to the end of the path, where he uncovers other signs of a violent struggle and a note from Holmes explaining that he knew about the hoax, but chose to fight Moriarty himself. Holmes and Moriarty have both fallen to their deaths down a gorge and their bodies cannot be recovered. As said, Dr. Watson returns to England. The Moriarty gang are all convicted on the strength of evidence secured by Holmes. Watson ends his narrative by saying that Sherlock Holmes was the best and wisest man he had ever known. What did you think of the story?
I enjoyed it, but I always enjoy it because it has Moriarty in it. And I
Hmm.
like Moriarty. I like the concept. I like the fact that there's equivalently, I could make a Doctor and Master joke here, but I won't. And it gives someone who Holmes is equivalently afraid of. It doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily say it's fear. He's saying it's a precaution, but it's actual fear. And that's
Right.
nice to see in a character.
Hmm. Yeah, it's this is. I mean, this is the most we see of Moriarty in the canon, but clearly he makes a huge impact, to the fact where the evil twin villain trope has just persisted ever since, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moriarty, like you said, Doctor Master, but I mean that there's a lot of adventure story relationships that are mirrors of the Holmes Moriarty dynamic. So this is something that clearly resonated, and so it's a bit interesting that Doyle introduces this right as he's about to wrap up. It's like my story, but it makes a degree of sense in the sense of I need someone that would be Holmes's equivalent to justify his sacrifice. And despite the fact that Moriarty doesn't appear in any story prior to this, it works. I feel it really sells the danger.
I think in somewhere I've read that one of the reasons Doyle wanted to make Moriarty is that he wanted Holmes to go out in a blaze of glory because that would
Hmm.
also soften the blow for the readers to
Right.
know
Yep.
that like he died at like a high doing something incredible instead of just like dying in his sleep, being shot by a random mugger. Holmes dead.
Right. And instead, what happened is Doyle inadvertently created Phantom. So not everything Doyle did was good. So take that for what you will. But what really happened was people were so upset, enamored, whatever, that they started to write their own theories as to what really happened. And this is what we now call headcanon. This is something that kind of created for this process because A, people didn't believe Holmes was really dead, so they all had theories as to why what actually happened to him. But also B, people started to retroactively find references to Moriarty in the stories that don't exist. So like people have argued that the Redheaded League was probably sponsored by Moriarty, and since you mentioned it, and given the nature of the con, it does feel like something that Holmes might come up with if he were a villain, right? There was a another story that had a villain that was just elaborate enough that a criminal mastermind could have inspired it. Bruce Partington plans, maybe I don't remember,
But one of the
but
things as a writer, though, is even if you don't intentionally write a specific character into something, there's always that nugget of an idea in the back of your
yep.
brain. And part of that could
Hmm.
have been influencing the stories are written, which is why people can make such easy correlations sometimes. Sometimes they're far fetched correlations, but sometimes they're also easy ones.
Right. And I think, I mean, we jokingly, lovingly give Doyle a lot of stick. I'm like, he did it for the money, and he didn't really care. But the reality is that Doyle's an objectively good writer. He just is. As much as you can poke holes in the plot holes and the inconsistencies of the canon, the fact is that the characters always feel true. And this is one of the reasons why I love The Final Problem is because it's not a mystery, right? It's straight up an adventure story. There's no real mystery solved here. So what it ends up being is a really good examination of Watson and Holmes's friendship. There's one of the reasons why I love it. Moriarty is the inciting incident to really examine how Watson and Holmes feel about each other. And so, I mean, even outside of the canon import of this story, just seems like Holmes sneaking to Watson's house to basically tell him, "I'm in trouble, man. I don't want you. I want you to get away from here because I'm worried that my trouble will come onto you." And Watson just going, "No, you're my friends. I will do anything for you." And that's really even in that stilted Victorian men trying to not show emotions thing, it still really comes across, and it's really powerful.
Because he gives up his practice, he gives up his home, and travels around for a while in this story. It's not
Yeah,
like a week; it is a chunk of time.
yeah, several
After they
weeks.
don't catch Moriarty, then they just sort of travel along. So
Right,
it's Eddie. I don't know about you. Well, you may have an easier time, but I don't have a job that I could get up and leave for like 2 or 3 months and come back and still be able to do it.
right. But actually, so again, weird historical things I study because I'm a Sherlock Holmes nerd. Apparently, there was a practice amongst doctors where they would literally uh, sell their practice for brief periods of time. So they could basically, another doctor could buy another doctor's patient list for a short
Hmm.
period of time, and so the
I think
patients would
it's
get redirected
mentioned.
to them.
I think it's mentioned in one of these stories. Actually,
It
maybe it's
is,
okay.
but it's mentioned just as selling my practice, which seems like he's selling the physical practice, and no, it's actually basically is I'm just selling you my client list for a period of time, and then you come back and you buy it back.
And
And
I've watched
so,
enough just general British historical British TV shows, and some of them have doctors that have done something like that before.
mhm, yeah, which is fascinating. But I mean, but still, I mean, Holmes or Watson's married, has a job, and with, let's be honest, an extremely sketchy story about air guns, Watson's like, cool, let's go. You know?
It's you jumped air guns. I'm talking about bricks being dropped off of a building. Someone dropped a brick, and I knew it was meant for my life. Really? Come on,
Right,
Holmes. Come on.
right. It's like, buddy, someone threw a rock at you, and now you're talking about air guns and climbing over my fence. And are you on the cocaine again? Because I think you might be on the cocaine again. You know?
But
But
drop of a
Watson's
hat.
not that.
He's up and he's gone.
Yeah, Watson's like, nope, I trust you. And like, I like to think of myself as a decent person, but if you show up at my house saying that someone threw a rock at your head and that now they're going to shoot you with secret spy guns that don't really exist, and now you need to climb up my back porch to escape, the alien death rays that are circling and attacking you, I might take a second before I immediately followed you into that. Might have some questions.
I am glad that you would still do it though. That is reassuring. I'll keep that in mind.
It's not completely off the table.
Although it is, I love the beauty of the descriptions about how they played this game of cat and mouse for an extended period of time between Holmes and Moriarty, and how it's laid out, but it's never given you any details about it. So you
Hmm.
get to envision of how complex it would be without spoiling the story or shifting emphasis from the relationships of those two and the adventure they're about to go on.
Yeah, yeah. You also reminded me, because we don't do written prose on this podcast very much. So speechless by the time we would talk about it. So I've kind of forgot to mention this, but Doyle's actual writing style is fantastic, right? I mean, it again, it clips along even for 120-year-old stories. But specifically, Doyle does something which we kind of underestimate the impact of, because only Poe has ever really done the same thing, which is writing the story as if it were true. This is what the Great Game comes about, is because at the very beginning, Watson says, I've been reading the papers and people talking about Sherlock Holmes' death and all the stories they've been spinning. And so I'm here to set the record straight. There were no other stories, right? There were no other newspaper discussions about this. They didn't exist, but it's written in such a way people are going, oh, did I miss that article? Like he's trying to write Watson as if Watson exists in the real world. And so that kind of what we now call metafictional conceit is really new. I think only Poe and maybe a couple other writers really have tried that kind of I'm writing as if everything I'm saying is true, even though we all know it's not, conceit.
And if I remember correctly, though, there was a similar thing, not for the written word, but of the radio with Orson Welles'
Yes.
broadcast of War of the Worlds. From how it
Hmm.
was done, people thought it was really fucking happening. Like, that is amazing.
Yeah, and I love that stuff. And so back to the trip thing is like, yeah, it's written like this was a real documentation of their stuff. And to be fair, Reichenbach Falls is a real place. The Inn is not, although of course someone built it because money.
Damn straight. Just
It's
how
like, oh,
people built from Twin Peaks. People suddenly there is a restaurant from Twin Peaks, and there's all this other
right,
stuff that was in Twin Peaks because there's money to be had.
right. But Reichenbach Falls is lots of Sherlockian tourists go to Reichenbach Falls. So it's like it's a real place, and so, there are even some that try to recreate that train trip. I mean, not with the running out and changing trains, obviously, but like take train to Canterbury and Canterbury over to blah blah, whatnot. I don't. I think World War II caused some of those tracks to be destroyed, so I don't think you can completely recreate that trip, but large chunks, but I think you can.
And I think Doyle was on a vacation, and when he encountered the Reichenbach Falls, as he said,
Mm-hmm.
"This is where I'm going to kill Holmes."
Yep. Yep. Right. And then we because of the first person nature of the stories, we don't actually see the final confrontation, which leaves just enough of a gap for the next story. But the way it's written, it's so obviously clear this is meant to be the finale, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just the way Holmes talks to Watson in that letter is I never get tired of reading that letter. I read these stories so many times that when we did this, I kind of just like the Speckled Band, I kind of just skimmed it to refresh myself of it, But this story, when I got near the end, I caught myself once again reading every word, because that from the moment that Watson rushes back to the falls, the whole story is written so well. But then that final letter, it's at that perfect balance of reserved and emotional. That is exactly their friendship.
It is, and for me though, I had to break out my copy of the Strand's like complete Sherlock Holmes and read it because I am not as familiar as you are with
Right.
these.
Right. Yeah. But still, I mean, it's a great scene, and also again really showcases Moriarty, because I mean you have to remember throughout this whole story, Watson never meets Moriarty. Watson, except for one stray reference to seeing a person, which the story implies is Moriarty, Watson's never met this guy. And that's another gap that's interestingly opened up, which I'll talk about in a second. But through the story, we are so convinced of how important Holmes' sacrifice is, and the way Holmes describes it, and therefore the way Doyle describes it, means that not only is the emotion of the scene conveyed, but also the danger of Moriarty conveyed.
Well, it's done through the Wharf principle, where you have a bad
Mm,
person show up, they beat up Wharf, it establishes how powerful they are,
yeah,
and that's how you get the audience on board. And it does that here.
right. Yes.
Any final thoughts on the final problem?
Just to finish my previous thought, I mentioned Watson's never seen Moriarty. The gap this opens up is one of the other non-canonical classics is the 7% Solution. I don't want to spoil too much of that, but it's by Nicholas Meyer. It caused the renaissance of Holmes in the 70s, and implies what if Moriarty didn't really exist? And it's a fascinating book that is not at all a traditional Sherlock Holmes story, but probably one of my top 20 non-canonical books. And yes, I
I
do
want
have
you to take a second and repeat what you just said.
top 20 non-canonical books.
Thank you. Yes, there you go, people. If you're curious who the geek on this podcast is, it is not me.
I'm going to just reach back here as we're recording and show Chris the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Mycroft Holmes book, and just put that back where I found it.
Hey, Eddie,
Yes.
who's Mycroft Holmes? We haven't talked about that person.
He hasn't showed up yet. We'll actually talk about him in the next story, because he does show up extremely briefly in that story. Oh, one point I do want to make is there's an explicit reference in Final Problem of 221B being set on fire. Remember that when we go into the next story. Anything else you want to talk about with Final Problem?
No, other than it is a great story. It always is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, The Empty House. The night of March 30th, an apparently unsolvable locked room murder takes place in London, the killing of the Honorable Ronald Adair. Dr. Watson visits the murder scene. He runs to an elderly, deformed book collector, later revealed as Sherlock Holmes in disguise. Contrary to what Watson believed, Holmes won against Professor Moriarty at Reichenbach Falls, explaining that he spent the next few years traveling to various parts of the world under the name of Sigurdsson. That evening, they entered an abandoned building known as Camden House, whose front room overlooks Baker Street. Holmes's room can be seen across the street. In the window is a lifelike waxwork bust of Holmes in profile. At approximately midnight, a sniper who has taken the bait fires a specialized air gun, scoring a direct hit on Holmes's dummy. Inspector Lestrade arrests the gunman, who's revealed as Colonel Sebastian Moran, Adair's whist partner and murderer. Holmes speculates that Adair had caught Moran cheating at cards and threatened to expose his dishonorable behavior. Moran, who is secretly the lieutenant of James Moriarty, earned a living playing cards crookedly and got rid of the one man who could rob him of his livelihood. There's not much plot here because most of this is just retconning Holmes's death.
Before you go into that, I want to know, do you think J.R. Tolkien read Sherlock Holmes?
Absolutely.
Do you think Tolkien then went, I need to take Gandalf off of the board for a little while in my stories. What is the best way possible to do that?
Throw him off the mountain?
Maybe I have him fall down a big pit fighting an incredibly powerful antagonist? Maybe? Okay.
And then appear under extremely implausible circumstances that are not well defined?
In the next book?
Yeah.
Okay. Had to do it. Couldn't help myself.
Yeah, so this is, again, the first example of a retcon, retroactive continuity, where Doyle realizes that he's being paid 20 times what he was being paid before, I think, at this point. It's a ridiculous amount of money. And so he's like, I need to unkill Sherlock Holmes. And kinda, sorta succeeds. So, as a note, there's 3 years between Holmes dying and Holmes coming back. So in the stories, he fell off Reichenbach in 1891. He rejoins Watson in 1894. This is known amongst fans as the Great Hiatus. And
I think you said from when we started, in actual publication time, it's about a decade, right?
Decade, right. Hound of the Baskervilles is written in between there, but the Final Problem was written in I just lost track of it. I want to say 1893, and this was published in 1903. So it was pretty much a solid decade between those stories.
Okay.
Which also shows you just how hot the market was for it, that even a decade later, people were still wanting these stories.
So Holmes transitioned from the Victorian age to when? Since he covered so much time?
Well, okay. Prior to this, the Holmes stories were kind of just roughly a year or two behind when they were being published. The chronology of them are a little wonky, but they generally more or less fall in line. From this point on, Holmes very rarely leaves the 19th century, canonically. There's a couple of stories set a little after 1900s, and there's one story that's explicitly set up in the build-up to World War I. But he's also very clearly retired by that point. So Holmes's career is pretty much Victorian, although Doyle was writing them well into the Edwardian age.
Okay. Thank you. But you were saying 3 years from Holmes's death to his resurrection.
Right. Known as the Great Hiatus by fans. And so much can be said about this. I have the annotated Sherlock Holmes, which is basically the Sherlock Holmes stories, but annotated by a very well-respected Sherlock Holmes scholar. And there are 7 pages of theories on just what Holmes does during the Great Hiatus. And most of them are some form of how much is Holmes telling Watson about his disguise as Sigurdsson is true, to a point where Holmes is actually dead, and Watson, realizing the world needed Sherlock Holmes, hired or found someone to pretend to be Sherlock Holmes for the rest of the stories, even to the point where at one point in time, Holmes is actually listed as potentially a sister, perhaps Enola, to take the place of Sherlock Holmes in the stories. Sherlock Holmes
I
fans are
love that
great.
idea. I love that idea even more, though.
Right.
Hiring someone to be Holmes, I love that better.
And of course, if you add sci-fi elements or horror elements into it, there's actually a short story, maybe a couple of short stories, of where Holmes is a ghost, and so Watson writing these stories is just pretending Holmes is really around, but actually Holmes is just straight up a ghost. So a lot of fun had around that. But part of the reason why the fun is happening is because remember I said before about if a guy comes into your house, starts ranting about people throwing bricks at your head and whatnot, that maybe you take a second guess. His story is even more implausible when he comes back. It's like, yeah, I traveled around the world and I was in the newspapers as a Swedish explorer, and the air gun thing, that's still real because they still want to shoot me. But I've been trying to clean up Mario's gang, which were explicitly all arrested at the end of the last story. And also, my rooms are completely preserved, which were explicitly set on fire in the last story.
I can't remember. Was this on fire? Or was it burned down? There's a difference because Mrs. Hudson could have broke out the fire extinguisher and put out that fire and keep that
That's the
fire off.
gap that some people use to explain is that he says that rooms were fired, which some Sherlockians have determined means that someone threw a firebomb through a window, not the place was burned down.
Miss Hudson could have like jumped on that, smothered it, and then rebuilt by herself with, to go back and quote a very important person, her own two hands. Sorry,
And
not sorry.
actually, the canon kind of defends you on this point because Mycroft, which is Holmes's elder brother, who is a member of the government, and his role is basically to be Sherlock Holmes, but a database for the government, means he also has access to money and resources. So he actually could have said he's explicitly in the story said he's preserved these rooms. So it may have been Mrs. Watson or Mrs. Hudson put the fire out, but her room's damaged, and so Mycroft said, "Cool, here's a bunch of money and people to help you fix that." Well, my own condition is his Holmes's rooms have to be put in the same condition because Mycroft knew that Sherlock was not dead.
Is it true that Mycroft is better than Holmes? In fact, he can solve all the cases from sitting in his chair.
That is what Holmes says in the Greek interpreter. And so the canon does not invalidate that interpretation, but doesn't really support that interpretation either. Because basically, the canon presents Mycroft as just lazy. He's like, he gets up, he goes to work, he goes to his club, he goes home, which is basically the equivalent of guy gets up, goes to his job, goes to his pub, goes home. He doesn't like go anywhere else. But yet, for a guy who's supposedly lazy, he does an awful lot in the backgrounds of these stories. So,
I think the premise of Mycroft is also what was used to create from Rex Stout's Nero Wolf.
yep. Mm-hmm.
And for then he gets Archie, who is equivalently like a mix of Sherlock and somewhat of Watson, because Archie isn't as smart as Sherlock is, but he's a lot more active.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as a huge Nero Wolf fan, I'm almost suggested that we do a Nero Wolf run because that's how much I like Nero Wolf.
Yeah. I actually don't know much about Nero Wolf, so I mean, that could be really fun. But also, yes, Mycroft as someone who sits in the center of governmental affairs and directs people to do things is believed to be one of the reasons why the James Bond's boss is abbreviated M. But anyhow, so yes, so Sherlock Holmes comes back from dead, scares the shit out of Watson, makes him keel over because that's what you do to your friend that you force him to believe is dead, and then straight up tells Watson, "I wanted to reach out to you, but I couldn't because I was afraid you couldn't keep your fucking mouth shut."
Which is not wrong.
It's not wrong, but still a bit harsh.
Watson, my arch nemesis that I told you was going to be following you, so be careful, followed you, and is why I had to pretend I was dead for 3 years.
Right, right. That's one of the, again, things I love about this relationship is because Sherlock can occasionally be pretty cruel to Watson. And the only times where Holmes is wrong is when he's deriding Watson's intelligence, because it's well, no one's as smart as you, so that's not really fair. And Watson is intelligent in his own right. But in things like Watson's trouble, he's so honest, he can't keep his mouth shut. The stories that Watson himself writes do kind of back that up. Even Watson's like, yeah, no, you're not entirely wrong. He's kind of blusters in this specific story, but in other stories, has been like, okay, maybe that's fair. I don't like it, not a fan of it, but maybe not wrong.
Oh, God.
But we also have Colonel Moran, who another significantly less iconic villain, but still has been used to great effect in a number of other spin-off stories. Not nearly as memorable as Moriarty, sadly. Although he's been used to good effect by very specific writers. But otherwise, he's just a guy with a gun.
That's big, though, from in this time frame. That is huge. Like, guns were not as predominant as they are now. Plus, I want to say, in British society, it was different, too.
Well, guns were more prevalent then than they are now in the UK. Watson carried a pistol around pretty openly with him, and his licensing for having a gun was, I used to be in the military. Oh, cool, then yeah, keep it. Basically, came down to. But the
There's a
air guns,
difference in, like, a pistol and a rifle, though.
true, and the air gun specifically is an interesting bit because this is also another reason why I like this story and why I chose it is Sherlock Holmes stories tend to defy genre a bit more than people realize. And this is a little bit Sherlock Holmes as techno thriller, right? Because airgun was super cutting edge technology from this Victorian perspective. Because the British military is trying to invent guns that were silent. And so this was a dead end. Ultimately, this thought process was never borne out, and silencers became the preferred way of handling this problem. But the idea of rather than powering bullets by explosive, can we power it by compressed air? There were actual air guns made and used. They just would often, the air compression was not as perfect as they could hope, so they would leak out, or it would deform the barrel, or it would cause things to spin, the bullet to spin badly, or just cause the gun to seize up. A couple times they even exploded. So it was not a good technology. But again, if you're writing a techno thriller, you take a military experimental program, just say, yeah, that's true, and then follow through on the thought process and what that adds to your story. So from that perspective, this is perfectly valid Tom Clancy-ish story writing.
Or if you didn't care about accuracy or doing your research, it would also work.
Well, right. Like the Mormons as a random example. But also the other thing that's interesting about this is it's also a trend a lot of people don't notice in Sherlock Holmes stories, in the sense that aside from Watson, who, as I pointed out, is not technically part of the military, even though he did service, every military person in Sherlock Holmes is evil, or at least stupid. There are no sympathetic military personnel in any of the Conan Doyle stories. Conan Doyle desperately wanted to be in the military. When World War One broke out, World War One broke out, he tried to sign up for military service and was rejected on the grounds of being far too old and out of shape. And then offered his services as a reporter or something. He just wanted to get in there, and they said no. So it's interesting to see, like you said before, about some of the writer in the stories. I wonder how much of that is him being bitter all of these years for not being part of the military.
Intriguing. On the
Yeah,
whole,
weirdly, there's not much to say about this story, frankly. I mean,
it's a
it's
good
interesting.
resurrection story.
Yeah.
If you have to bring a character back, it's good enough because you get the beats of it back. You get people engaged with the characters again. You give them an outlandish reason why the character's not dead and what they've been up to, and you get to bring in more Mycroft. So it's has nice beats, but as you said, there's not a lot to go into for it.
Right. I mean, it is by the nature of what it is the only two-part Sherlock Holmes story. So you could also make an argument that this is the creation of the season finale cliffhanger trope, you know, to be continued. I mean, that's not what this is intended to be, but that's what ends up retroactively being as a result. And it is, I mean, there's a lot of things don't line up, but that happens pretty commonly in a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories. The fact that this is the only one that directly follows off a previous one is where you see those themes a little more. But beyond that, it's easy to forget that there's 10 years between these stories, right? Like
Yeah.
Doyle's just immediately back on his game and writes a cracking yarn, if you will.
So then, to wrap up the empty house bit, if you had to choose another story from, I think this is the Return of Sherlock Holmes book.
Yep.
Which one would you pick?
Probably from this later era. There's a couple. The more common answer is Disappearance of Lady Carfax, because that's a nice late era Sherlock Holmes story that has an interesting twist, and it's still reasonably good. But the one that's kind of I think the more iconic one is the vampire one, Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. That's it. Where it's another example of everyone believes a supernatural solution, and Holmes finds the very natural solution, but the solution does involve people's motivations and character, which is something that, to be fair, Doyle was not always great with in his early works. The motivations of the victims were kind of just there. I mean, cycle bands. Dude kills daughters because money, and that's basically the whole story. The foibles of the characters become the reason why the quote unquote crime happens. And also, it's a good sense of Doyle really continuing to push those blurring of genre boundaries.
Nice.
How about you? Do you have any late stories?
As I am not as familiar with the returns because I didn't read those as much, the ones that still jump out in my brain are like the Dancing Men and the Six Napoleons. Like,
Explains good.
Those are the ones I remember the best. So those would be my picks if I had to. But like I read a lot of the adventures a couple times, and I read the memoirs some, but by return, I don't really go. I don't return to it a lot. Huh.
Yeah. And to be fair, that's a pretty common experience, right? Like a lot of people really love the early, really it until Sherlock Holmes dies are some of the best stories, and then after that it's much more of a mixed bag. I mean, granted, you do get the Adventure of the Cardboard Box where Holmes literally gets mailed a pair of ears, so I mean, it's not all bad. It was so graphic, quote unquote graphic, that the American publishers actually refused to publish it initially. So I mean, there's a lot more, but also it's interesting because Doyle's more experimental in his back half. So there's like a story where a guy injects himself with monkey blood and becomes a monster because why not? There's one where Holmes infiltrates a German camp in World War One and becomes a spy for England. There's a story where Watson's not the storyteller, but it's actually told from Holmes's perspective. So I mean, there's more derivations and interesting dynamism in the later half. But in terms of just really solid, good stories, it's super clear that Doyle's writing stories just to amuse himself, and that's the reason why he's doing things. Like, I gotta write another fucking Holmes story. What do I do with this? I don't know. Maybe he pretends to record himself on a record player to trick someone into confessing he stole a diamond. I guess I don't know. So for consistently solid, good storytelling, good writing, we tend to think of the first half of the canon. So you're not alone in that.
any closing thoughts on the written works of Doyle?
Read them. They're great. I love them. There
Get your
are,
body tattooed with them.
yeah, seriously. I have some suggestions. I have thoughts. Maybe not the syringe one. I've had people ask me questions about that. I have a doctor's bag with syringes on them, and people have asked me questions, and it's like, no, but it's a Sherlock Holmes thing. Do you not know about the cocaine? All right, never mind. But yeah, I mean, like if you're not sure, I would recommend skipping over the first two novels. Definitely skip A Study in Scarlet. If you have to read the opening, read the first two chapters, then skip the rest. A Sign of Four is okay. It's not great. It's okay.
Mm.
Start with the adventures. If you like those, then go back and read those, and then just keep reading until you stop. Because frankly, they're just good stories. And to our mission statements, they do frequently bend and merge genre way more than I think people realize.
Yeah, hands down. That's why they're so much fun to read.
Mm-hmm.
All
Cool.
right. So then, sorry.
Oh, I'd say cool.
So then, next time we'll be covering the 1930s with Basil Rathbone, the Hounds of the
Mm-hmm.
Baskerville, 1939, and the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 1939. You will potentially have to try to find those online, unless you're like me, that Eddie doesn't know. Is I picked those big bad boys up on DVD decades ago, so they're in fact upstairs, and I'm going to watch them like that. You may, who knows, with Amazon Prime these days, they may also be on Amazon Prime streaming, because they have a lot of old movies that are like hidden gems.
Yeah, I will note that, and we'll talk more about this next episode, but these two movies are still in copyright, and so therefore you do have to find legal ways to acquire them. But you'll see lots of Basil Rathbone movies online that appear to be free. That's because they switched studios. They did not do proper filing, so they're all fell into the public domain very early on. They're completely different films, so we're not covering them. So they specifically find 1939 films is what we're talking about here.
Eddie, if people are looking for you online and to get some of your amazing work, where could they make those things happen at?
I would, as usual, mentioned my website, pugsteady.com. But for the next run of this, if you are particularly interested in my thoughts on Sherlock Holmes, I have written a book about this. It is called Watson is Not an Idiot. And you can find that online at Amazon. And I do get a cut of that. So it's one of the few things I've worked on that actually I do get a percentage of. So if you are excited about the stuff, there's an audiobook version of it. There's POD, there's digital version. And I go through all of the original canonical stories and talk about them and give context for them like we did with this episode. So if you like this specific episode about talking about the original stories, pick up Watson's Not an Idiot.
Did you read the audiobook yourself so people can hear your dulcet tones?
No, they hired an actual proper narrator who doesn't sound like a gibbering chipmunk. Where can they find your stuff, Chris?
If you're looking for me, you can find me in the Dark Goo Discord. I've got a Patreon called Harlem Unbounding with Chris Spivey. Or if you want, you can go to Chaosium and buy Harlem Unbound Second Edition. Or you can just come to the Dark Goo website and find Haunted West. And eventually I'll put up some free stuff that I keep working on that I have yet to do. Time is not my friend.
If only you didn't have this silly podcast to keep distracting you from work.
I know. I keep thinking to myself, maybe one day, but then every week Eddie says, hey, let's do this thing again. So here I am.
Dear. So with that, we will see you and everybody else next week when we start talking about Basil Rathbone.